Welcome to the Silent Empires, where quiet stories carry the most weight, and the night feels a little deeper with every word. This is a place for slow storytelling, shadowed worlds, and listeners who enjoy disappearing into a calm voice while the rest of the world fades away. No ads, no interruptions, just uninterrupted stories told in the stillness of the night. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a like and become part of the experience. And in the comments, tell me, what city are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? I love seeing how many different people, from different places around the world, are sharing this same quiet moment together. The camera opens on grainy footage from the mid-1980s. Sun-bleached Florida pavement, a column of reporters, the whir of news cameras as a small, compact man in a dark suit is led toward a courthouse door. His hair is thinning, his posture slightly bent, but his expression is hard, controlled. Microphones are thrust toward him. A reporter shouts a question about organized crime, about the Gambino family, about a violent beating that has shocked even seasoned investigators. The man keeps his eyes forward, flanked by United States Marshals. For law enforcement, he is one more link in a chain they have been trying to break for decades. For the people who borrowed money from him, who placed bets through his network, he is a familiar presence, a figure who moved comfortably between dimly lit back rooms and expensive Florida restaurants. The name on the indictment is Thomas Agro. It is the closing act of what authorities will describe as a long criminal career, part of a broader war between federal agencies and the American mafia. The era is defined by wiretaps and witness protection programs, by RICO indictments and televised perp walks. Men who once operated in shadows are being dragged into the light, their coded conversations played back in courtrooms. Newspapers in New York, Miami, and West Palm Beach run headlines about mob infiltration and northern crime families colonizing the South. At the center of one of these cases is Agro, accused not of cinematic robberies or gangland shootouts, but of something in many ways more insidious: the quiet, relentless pressure of illegal debt, the control of vulnerable people through fear, and the spread of a criminal organization into a region that once considered itself beyond such reach. To understand how he arrived at that courthouse door, how a man from the tightly packed streets of mid-century New York ended up as a key Florida representative of one of America's most notorious crime families, we have to step back, not just into his own early life, but into the world that shaped him. Because if the final chapters of Thomas Agro's story belong to prosecutors, informants, and judges, the opening chapters belong to a specific time and place in American history. The crowded tenements and social clubs of Italian-American neighborhoods, the uneasy coexistence of aspiration and criminal opportunity, and a society that often looked the other way as long as the streets seemed calm and the businesses stayed open. The available public record on Agro's childhood is sparse. Unlike better-known underworld figures whose lives were exhaustively documented in biographies and court exhibits, Agro spent his formative decades largely below the radar of the press. What can be pieced together comes from scattered law enforcement files, later testimony, and the contextual knowledge historians have developed about men of his generation and milieu. Most sources place his birth in the early 1930s, in or around New York City, into an Italian-American family at a moment when that community was still adjusting to life in the United States. The early 1930s were hard years for working-class families of any background, and Italian immigrants and their children often lived a rung or two below even that. The Great Depression hollowed out factories and construction jobs, and the promise that America would reward hard work seemed, in many neighborhoods, more like a distant slogan than a lived reality. In the densely populated blocks of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx where Italian families clustered, households were frequently large, incomes small, and space limited. Apartments were crowded with several siblings sharing a bed, and the sound of neighbors, voices, radios, arguments, bleeding through thin walls. In such districts, the presence of organized crime was not an aberration. It was one fact among many that shaped daily life. Men who today are recalled as bosses and capos were in those decades familiar local figures. They attended the same weddings and funerals, sat at the same cafe tables, and walked the same streets as everyone else. Some were owners or silent partners in small businesses. A restaurant here, a bar there, a social club with frosted windows that seemed to be full at all hours. For a child coming of age in that environment, the lines between legitimate community leadership and criminal power could be difficult to see. Historians of the American Mafia have shown how the structure of Italian-American neighborhoods in those years created both insulation and opportunity for criminal networks. Language barriers and discrimination often pushed immigrants toward tight-knit enclaves where trust flowed along family and regional lines. Within those enclaves, local men of respect could step into roles that, in other communities, might have belonged to banks, unions, or political parties. They could provide loans when banks declined, settle disputes when lawyers were out of reach, and exert influence in the local political clubhouses. That pattern was already in place when Agro was a boy, and it would have colored the texture of his surroundings. In many homes, parents of his generation emphasized hard work and education, hoping their children would become professionals or at least secure steady union jobs. At the same time, young men in the neighborhood would have seen another model of success. Older figures who seemed to have money when others did not, who wore better suits, who drove nicer cars, and who were treated with overt deference. For some, those figures were a warning. For others, they were a temptation. The record does not show which specific conversations or choices steered Agro as a teenager, but by the time his name appears in police intelligence files decades later, it is clear he had chosen a path firmly aligned with the underworld side of that spectrum. The childhood years for someone of Agro's cohort in New York were inevitably shaped by the Second World War. Ration books, newsreels, casualty lists, these were part of the backdrop to daily life. Many older boys volunteered or were drafted, leaving small businesses short of staff and opening opportunities for younger teenagers to take on work, both legitimate and not. In Italian-American neighborhoods in particular, the war years also had a complicated effect on attitudes toward authority. Public displays of patriotism were common, yet there remained a wary distance from official institutions, rooted in the discrimination many families had faced. Informal networks of kin, neighbors, and local friends retained their importance. In this context, gambling occupied a curious place. Illegal bookmakers and numbers runners operated in plain sight in many working-class communities. For people who held low-wage jobs or irregular work, placing small bets was a form of entertainment or a hopeful reach for something better. The neighborhood bookie was a familiar, even convivial presence. The man you saw in the corner of the bar, the back room of the candy store, the table at the social club, notebook in hand. Behind that seemingly casual interaction, however, ran a network that connected small street-level operators to larger criminal organizations, including the emerging national mafia structure that federal agents would later call La Cosa Nostra. It is within that world, the everyday routine of street corner bookmakers and backroom card games, that Agro's later activities make the most sense. By the 1950s, as he moved from adolescence into adulthood, New York's Italian-American crime families were entering a new phase. The chaotic violence of the Prohibition era had given way to a more structured system. The famous Commission, a kind of national leadership council for major families, had been established in the 1930s. In New York, what would later be known as the Gambino family was consolidating under figures such as Albert Anastasia, and from 1957 onward, Carlo Gambino. They focused increasingly on steady, low-profile revenue streams, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and control over certain unions and construction projects. These were not operations that announced themselves with gunfire in the street. They depended on relationships, on people who could be trusted to handle money, to keep quiet, and to represent the interests of their superiors in day-to-day dealings. Men like Agro, who would later be named in federal documents as part of the Gambino network, emerged first as associates and facilitators. In practical terms, that meant helping to run betting operations, extending and collecting on high-interest loans, and ensuring that those who did business with the organization understood the consequences of defaulting, even when the specifics of those consequences remained understated. Law enforcement attention to organized crime in the 1950s was inconsistent. While the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover would eventually become deeply involved in mafia cases, during these years, Hoover publicly downplayed the existence of a nationwide criminal syndicate, focusing instead on bank robbers and political subversives. At the local level, many police departments were under-resourced, and in some instances compromised, when it came to investigating gambling and vice. This relative lack of pressure allowed underworld networks to deepen their roots in communities, and it allowed figures like Agro to build careers largely out of public view. There is no detailed public chronology of Agro's first arrests or early brushes with the law. What emerges instead from later court records is a picture of someone who, by the 1960s and 1970s, was no newcomer to the world of illegal gambling and debt collection. When federal agents and prosecutors in those later decades described him, they consistently did so as a seasoned operator, not a recent recruit. That characterization implies a long on-ramp, years of learning how bets were recorded and settled, how credit was extended to gamblers, how pressure was applied to those who fell behind, and how all of this could be managed while attracting as little official attention as possible. The broader social environment in which he came of age also shifted dramatically in those middle decades of the 20th century. The post-war boom brought rising incomes, and for many Italian-American families, a gradual move out of crowded city tenements and into more spacious outer borough neighborhoods or suburbs. Some left the old ethnic enclaves entirely. For others, however, the same period saw organized crime deepen its hold, precisely because there was now more disposable income to tap. Legal forms of gambling were still heavily restricted. Las Vegas was a distant destination, and state lotteries were not yet widespread. For people who wanted to bet on sports or numbers, the local bookmaker remained the most accessible option. The demand that would later fuel Agro's operations in Florida already existed in the streets of his youth. At the same time, patterns of migration within the United States were beginning to reshape the underworld map. By the 1960s and early 1970s, large numbers of retirees and working-class families from northern cities were moving to Florida, drawn by climate and cost of living. They brought their habits with them, including the habit of placing bets with bookies they'd known for years. Organized crime groups in New York recognized this demographic shift not just as a social fact, but as a business opportunity. Sending trusted men south to cultivate and control that market became a logical extension of their existing activities. When Thomas Agro eventually surfaced in law enforcement investigations in Florida, it was as one of those envoys. Before that relocation, however, there were the years in which he earned the trust of his superiors. In mafia structure, the term associate described someone who did business with a crime family but was not formally initiated. To become a full soldier, a made man, required sponsorship, a record of reliable service, and acceptance into the tightly guarded inner ranks. Various sources describe Agro as a made member of the Gambino family by the time of his Florida operations, suggesting that at some earlier point he had crossed that threshold. The ceremony itself, if it occurred, has not been publicly documented in detail. What is clear is that this status would have formalized a relationship that, in practical terms, had been developing for years. The qualities that made someone valuable in that world were not those celebrated in mainstream society. Discretion, loyalty to the organization over all other ties, and a willingness to enforce agreements outside the boundaries of legal contracts. These were highly prized. At the same time, successful operators needed a kind of rough charisma, the ability to cultivate customers, to project both friendliness and latent menace, to move comfortably in restaurants, bars, and private clubs where much of the trade was conducted. Witnesses who later encountered Agro in Florida settings recalled him as someone who could be affable and joking one moment, then suddenly, chillingly serious when discussing money owed. Those accounts, however, describe a man already in mid-career. The seedbed of those traits, the lessons in how to speak, how to posture, how to read people, were almost certainly laid down in his earlier life in New York. Politically and culturally, the mid-century decades were also a time when the myth of the romantic gangster began to take shape in popular media. Films and novels portrayed mobsters as anti-heroes, men who operated according to their own code in a corrupt world. In Italian-American neighborhoods, reactions to these depictions were complex. Pride in visibility mixed with frustration at stereotypes, fascination with power set against the harsh realities of addiction, debt, and violence that often followed in organized crime's wake. For someone like Agro, steeped in both the real and the mythologized versions of the underworld, that cultural backdrop may have played a role in how he understood his own trajectory, even if he never spoke publicly about it. What the historical record does allow us to say with confidence is that by the time federal attention began to focus on him, Thomas Agro was not a transient figure in the world of illegal gambling. He was regarded by investigators as a central node in a web of bettors, debtors, collectors, and higher-ranking mob leaders. To have reached that position required more than simple opportunism. It required years of functioning inside a subculture with its own expectations, dangers, and rewards, years shaped by the specific circumstances of mid-20th century New York. The presence of entrenched mafia families, the blurred line between legitimate and illegitimate business in certain industries, and the enduring willingness of many people to seek quick credit or the thrill of a wager outside legal channels. The New York of his formative years was a city in flux, moving from depression to war to post-war boom, from tenements to highways, from Ellis Island to suburban cul-de-sacs. Yet through all those changes, certain patterns endured. The social clubs with drawn blinds, the unregistered bets, the quiet threats that kept money flowing up the chain. In that continuity lies the clearest explanation for how someone like Agro could emerge. As the product of an ecosystem that, for decades, made it possible, and for some, attractive, to build a life in the shadows of the law. In later years, when Thomas Agro's name would appear in newspaper headlines and courtroom transcripts, it would be attached to stories of intimidation, illegal profits, and eventual legal reckoning. But those later events grew out of a long, mostly undocumented apprenticeship in the world of underground gambling and organized crime, an apprenticeship grounded in the streets and social structures of his youth. The boy who walked those streets in the 1930s and 1940s did so at a time when the institutions of the American Mafia were solidifying, when figures like Carlo Gambino were turning local rackets into national enterprises, and when local boys, with the right mix of connections and temperament, could imagine a future working for those enterprises. That future for Agro would lead far from the neighborhoods where it began, southward, into the rapidly growing communities of Florida, where retirees played cards in condo clubhouses and off-track betting lines hummed quietly behind restaurant doors. There, the skills and relationships he had developed over decades in New York would be put to new use, and the consequences, for him, for his associates, and for those who fell into his debt, would finally bring his long, obscure life to the attention of the wider public. In mid-century New York, before that southward move and the court dates that would define his public image, Thomas Agro was quietly learning how an illicit economy really worked. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, his name was beginning to appear in police intelligence reports, not as a headline suspect, but as one of the many figures orbiting around known members of the Gambino crime family. Detectives compiling those reports were trying to trace who met whom, who called whom, who showed up regularly at certain social clubs and restaurants. Agro's presence in that paper trail signaled that he was no longer just a neighborhood face. He was part of the machinery. In those years, New York's underworld was dominated by the long shadows of bosses like Carlo Gambino, where earlier leaders had courted publicity, riding in big cars, socializing in public clubs. Gambino emphasized staying out of the spotlight. The business model followed suit. Large-scale bootlegging had vanished with prohibition. Instead, the money was in activities that could be woven into the fabric of everyday life. Gambling, high-interest loans, control of certain trucking routes, construction contracts, and union locals. The core idea was simple. If an activity involved regular cash flow and a degree of risk, there was space for someone willing to operate outside normal rules. Men like Agro were valuable precisely because they understood how to move in that gray zone between what was technically illegal and what was socially tolerated. Illegal gambling was, in many ways, the keystone. Across the city, bookmakers took wagers on horse races, sports events, and daily numbers based on lottery-style combinations. The operation was organized in layers. At the bottom, the individual writers who met bettors and recorded wagers. Above them, the banks or offices where bets were tallied and payouts tracked. Above those, the individuals who financed the enterprise and settled accounts, making sure that a bad week at the racetrack wouldn't bankrupt the entire system. Law enforcement accounts from later decades consistently place Agro in the world of bookmaking and its close cousin, loan sharking. He was not the man on the corner taking $2 bets. He operated further up the chain, where credit was extended and money moved in thicker bundles. Credit was the second pillar. In legal commerce, extending credit is regulated and backed by courts. In the world Agro inhabited, it was propped up by reputation and the possibility of coercion. Loan sharking filled gaps left by mainstream banks and finance companies. Gamblers who lost more than they could pay in 1 week, small business owners scrambling to meet payroll or cover an unexpected expense, even relatively stable wage earners who had slid into a cycle of betting and borrowing, all might turn to a loan from someone connected. They would receive cash quickly, with minimal paperwork, but at interest rates that ballooned rapidly. Court records from later cases describe patterns that were standard across the country. Weekly service charges that never reduced the principal, threats when payments fell behind, and a steady escalation of pressure designed to keep borrowers paying as long as possible. Agro's emerging role in this structure reflected a particular skill set. He had to be able to evaluate who was a worthwhile risk, who might be squeezed hard without attracting too much attention, and who was likely to collapse or flee. He needed to maintain relations with higher-ranking figures who supplied capital and protection, while also managing the volatile personalities of problem gamblers and struggling entrepreneurs. Later testimony from individuals who encountered him in business settings in Florida paints a portrait that likely had its origins in New York. He could be personable and even disarming, speaking in a calm, conversational tone, yet underlying that was a firmness that made the stakes unmistakable. As the 1960s progressed, law enforcement's approach to organized crime began to change. The 1957 Appalachian meeting, when dozens of mob figures were famously detained at a rural estate in upstate New York, had forced a reluctant FBI to acknowledge that a national criminal network existed. Congressional hearings and investigative journalism brought terms like Cosa Nostra into public discourse. Still, enforcement on the street remained uneven. Many gambling operations continued with only sporadic interference from local police, often resulting in minor charges or fines that were treated simply as costs of doing business. For every social club raided or wire room shut down, others remained untouched. The introduction of the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970 marked a deeper shift. For the first time, prosecutors had a tool that allowed them not just to charge individuals with isolated crimes, but to argue that those crimes were part of a continuing criminal enterprise. RICO cases could reach higher into the hierarchy, targeting those who ordered or benefited from illegal activity, rather than only those who carried it out at street level. Yet before those laws could be effectively used, investigators needed detailed knowledge of how families like the Gambinos structured their operations, who answered to whom, and who handled particular regions or types of rackets. It was during this transition period that Agro's trajectory began to intersect more obviously with national trends. The Gambino family, like other New York families, was looking south. Florida was changing rapidly. Air travel had become cheaper and more accessible, transforming what had once been a long journey into a relatively simple flight. Retirees were flocking to new developments along both coasts, turning small towns into burgeoning cities. The state's pari-mutuel industry, horse racing, greyhound racing, jai alai, offered both entertainment and opportunities for skimming and influence. Legal gambling at the tracks coexisted with a flourishing illegal market, catering to sports bettors and others who preferred wagering with a local bookmaker to standing in line at a betting window. For organized crime leadership in New York, Florida represented both a new market and a kind of seasonal extension of existing ones. Many of their longtime customers, bettors and borrowers, were now spending winters or full retirement years in the Sunshine State. If the family wanted to keep their business, they would need trusted people on the ground. Law enforcement intelligence in the 1970s began to describe an influx of snowbird mobsters, men who kept homes or apartments in both New York and Florida, moving with the seasons, maintaining a presence in two worlds. In this period, Agro's name becomes associated not only with New York activities but with South Florida, especially the booming coastal counties where transplanted northerners were settling. The move was not, for someone in his position, a casual relocation. It was a strategic assignment. Florida was not an open frontier. Other families, including those from Tampa and Chicago, had their own long-standing interests in the state. The Gambinos needed operators who could build and maintain territory without sparking unnecessary conflicts, and who could also reassure nervous local contacts that doing business with New York was worth the risk. Someone with Agro's background, deeply familiar with how betting and loans worked in northern cities, seasoned but not so famous that his presence would immediately draw headlines, fit the profile. The Florida Agro encountered in the 1970s was a layered landscape. Along the beaches, retirees walked early morning circuits and played shuffleboard in condominium courtyards. Just inland, shopping centers and low-rise office buildings spread across what had been scrubland a decade earlier. In the back rooms of certain bars and restaurants, card games ran late into the night, and money changed hands in quieter conversations over coffee. Horse racing at tracks like Gulfstream Park and Hialeah drew crowds. So did football on television, as transplanted fans bet on teams from New York, Chicago, and Boston. The habits of a lifetime didn't change just because someone had moved south. For many, placing a bet with a familiar kind of figure, a bookmaker connected, or rumored to be connected, to a major crime family, felt like an extension of the old neighborhood. Agro's task was to knit these habits into a reliable revenue stream. According to later FBI reports and court filings, he became a central figure in a network of bookmakers and loan sharks operating in parts of South Florida. Some of these men were local. Others, like him, maintained ties to New York or New Jersey. Money flowed both ways. Profits moved north, while instructions and occasional reinforcements traveled south. In an era before widespread electronic banking, Much of this was done in cash, carried in envelopes, luggage, or the glove compartments of cars that made regular runs along the East Coast. The essential dynamics of the business remained those Agro had learned years earlier. A bettor who had a bad week might be quietly offered credit, especially if he appeared to have steady income or assets. A small business owner, perhaps someone running a bar, a repair shop, or a landscaping service, might be approached with an offer of a short-term bridge loan to cover expenses between payments. The terms were often explained in simple, almost casual language. The reality, as many later discovered, was unforgiving. Interest mounted rapidly, and missing a payment could bring a personal visit from Agro or one of his associates. In interviews conducted by law enforcement and later by journalists, some of those who fell into this web described a similar pattern: initial friendliness, gradually increasing pressure, and a growing sense that they were dealing not with an individual, but with an organization. Florida authorities were not blind to these developments. Local police departments, sheriffs, offices, and state agencies had been dealing with illegal gambling and related crimes for decades. What changed in the 1970s was the intensity of coordination with federal agencies. The Justice Department created organized crime strike forces in several key cities, including Miami, concentrating prosecutors and investigators whose sole job was to understand and dismantle syndicate operations. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, and undercover agents became more common tools. In this environment, Agro's efforts to keep a low profile were increasingly challenged by the growing sophistication of law enforcement. One of the most important developments for investigators was the gradual breakdown of the mafia's code of silence, or omerta, a combination of lengthy prison sentences, internal disputes, and the protection offered by federal witness programs began to convince some insiders to cooperate. When they did, they brought with them a wealth of detail about how operations like Agro's were structured. They could explain who reported to whom, how profits were divided, what signals indicated a man was speaking not just for himself, but for his superiors. Even when these cooperators had never dealt with Agro personally, their testimony provided a framework into which investigators could fit the pieces they were collecting on him through surveillance and local arrests. By the late 1970s, Agro had become a name of interest well beyond South Florida. Internal FBI memoranda and organized crime assessments, later quoted in press accounts and declassified documents, identified him as a soldier in the Gambino family, operating primarily in Florida on their behalf. That label soldier had specific meaning. It indicated that he was not merely an associate or freelance operator, but a formally recognized member of the organization, authorized to conduct business, and when necessary, enforce agreements in its name. For prosecutors building future cases, this status would be important. It connected his local actions to a broader enterprise, opening the door to RICO theories that would argue each act of extortion or illegal collection was not an isolated crime, but part of an ongoing racketeering pattern. At the same time, Agro's world was entering a period of instability. In New York, Carlo Gambino had died in 1976, and his chosen successor, Paul Castellano, faced internal dissent and increased law enforcement scrutiny. The 1970s also brought economic shocks, the oil crisis, inflation, that affected both legitimate and illegitimate markets. For underworld operators, this meant both opportunity and risk. People in financial distress might be more likely to borrow or gamble in hopes of a quick win, but they were also more likely to default. Collectors like Agro were, in effect, trying to squeeze revenue from a population whose ability to pay was less predictable than during the boom years. The tension between maintaining income and avoiding unwanted attention shaped the choices he and his counterparts made. Occasionally, borrowers who felt trapped went to the authorities. Sometimes they did so quietly, feeding information over time. Sometimes they did so only after pressure had escalated to a point they felt they could no longer endure. Each such contact gave investigators another window into Agro's methods, how he spoke to debtors, how often he made personal appearances versus using intermediaries, what kinds of non-physical pressure, threats to reputations, to family relationships, to business interests, he used to keep people in line. Within the Gambino family, the Florida operation remained just one part of a much larger picture that included rackets in New York's garment district, control over certain trucking and construction interests, and alliances with other families. Yet for federal agents based in Miami and West Palm Beach, Agro was not an incidental figure. He was a visible manifestation of northern organized crime's reach into their jurisdiction, a man whose conviction could serve both as a blow to the Gambinos' finances and as a deterrent message to others contemplating similar moves. The stage was thus set for confrontation. On one side stood a man who had spent decades learning how to operate in the shadowed spaces of American economic life, who had risen in the underworld hierarchy by being useful, reliable, and when he deemed it necessary, intimidating. On the other side stood a coalition of law enforcement agencies armed with new statutes, new investigative techniques, and a growing roster of insiders willing to talk. The collision between these two trajectories would, in the early 1980s, bring Agro out of the semi-anonymity he had long cultivated and place his name, and his methods, before judges, juries, and the broader public. By the end of the 1970s, the man who had once been just another face in New York's tight Italian-American enclaves was a known quantity in certain circles 2,000 kilometers to the south. In the bars and restaurants of Palm Beach County and neighboring communities, Thomas Agro's name moved quietly from mouth to mouth when conversations turned to off-track betting or quick, no questions asked loans. He was not a celebrity figure. He did not seek newspaper coverage or social prominence. His influence took a different form, a steady, persistent presence in the background of local gambling and credit, a man whose approval or disapproval could change the fortunes of people who liked to wager more than they could afford, or whose businesses were always one bad month away from collapse. His day-to-day life, as later reconstructed by law enforcement and by those who dealt with him, followed a routine that blended into the Florida landscape. He frequented racetracks and card rooms, but he was just as often seen at unremarkable coffee shops and family-style restaurants, the kinds of places where booths offered privacy and the clatter of dishes masked low conversations. Much of his work was done by telephone. Before pagers and mobile phones became widespread, carefully managed landlines were the lifeblood of underground gambling operations. Associates called in betting lines, odds on games and races, set by larger bookmakers in New York or Las Vegas. Local bettors called intermediaries, who in turn reported to people like Agro. He fielded calls, gave instructions, and kept a running mental ledger of who owed what, and to whom. The operations he oversaw were not massive in the way of multinational corporations, but they were deeply embedded in the rhythms of the communities they served. Retirees who had spent their working lives in northern cities brought their sports loyalties and betting habits with them. Construction workers and small contractors, buoyed by Florida's building boom, sometimes took home more cash than they had ever seen and were willing to risk a portion of it on football games, boxing matches, or the daily numbers. Local bar owners and restaurateurs, eager to keep regulars coming back, tolerated or quietly facilitated betting on their premises. In this ecosystem, Agro functioned as organizer and guarantor. He linked the desires of individual bettors and borrowers to the resources and the expectations of a major New York crime family. The structure that supported his position was familiar from his New York years, adapted to regional conditions. At the bottom level were writers and small-time bookmakers who took bets from individual customers. They were the visible face of the enterprise, the person a bettor saw every week, the man he called from his living room before kickoff. These local figures, in turn, answered to a smaller number of coordinators who consolidated bets, calculated balances, and managed the local sheet. Above them, someone like Agro provided financing and access to larger pools of money and credit. He could cover a bad week of payouts, extend larger lines of credit to preferred bettors, and absorb shocks that would have bankrupted smaller operators. In return, he took a share of the profits and maintained authority over how the business was conducted. Parallel to this gambling economy ran the loan sharking side of the operation. Here, the mechanisms were simpler and darker. Money was advanced at high interest, often to people who had few other options. A bettor who fell too far behind might be offered a loan to clean the slate, only to find himself trapped in an even more onerous cycle of payments. A small business owner facing an emergency repair or a gap in cash flow might borrow to keep the doors open, hoping that future sales would allow him to catch up. The loans were seldom accompanied by written contracts. The terms were discussed verbally, sometimes in reassuring tones, but always underpinned by an unspoken reality. Default carried consequences. Those consequences did not need to be spelled out in graphic terms to have power. By the late 1970s, the reputation of the Gambino family and other New York organizations had seeped into popular culture and private fears. People who dealt with Agro understood, or believed, that behind him stood a network capable of making life uncomfortable, even dangerous for those who failed to honor their obligations. It was this perception, as much as any specific threat, that kept most borrowers in line. Payment schedules were met not because contracts demanded it, but because the alternative seemed worse. For years, this system generated steady income with relatively little official disruption. Individual bookmakers might be arrested in occasional raids, charged with gambling offenses, fined, and sometimes given short jail terms. For the larger operation, these were acceptable losses. They did not touch the deeper structure, and they did little to alter the behavior of habitual bettors. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. Federal and state agencies had begun to recognize that combating organized crime required more than sporadic enforcement. In Florida, this recognition intersected with a broader national push against racketeering. The Justice Department's organized crime strike forces brought together prosecutors and investigators who devoted their full attention to figures like Agro. They coordinated with local police, shared intelligence with counterparts in New York, and invested in longer-term investigations that might produce evidence of conspiracy and enterprise, rather than just isolated offenses. They studied telephone toll records, watched who met whom in parking lots and diners, and tried to turn minor arrestees into informants. Through these efforts, a clearer picture of Agro's role emerged. He was not simply another bookmaker, but a conduit between Florida's illegal gambling economy and the Gambino family leadership in New York. The challenge for law enforcement was turning that picture into admissible evidence. Surveillance could show patterns of association, but not necessarily the content of conversation. Raids on gambling locations might yield betting slips and cash, but the people at the scene were often several steps removed from Agro himself. To build a substantial case, investigators needed someone inside his circle who was willing to talk in detail about how the operation worked, and crucially, to record conversations that could withstand legal scrutiny. It was at this point that the path of Thomas Agro intersected with that of a man whose decisions would do more than any raid or wiretap to unravel his Florida network: Joseph Yannuzzi. Yannuzzi was a New York-born gambler and self-styled hustler who had moved in and out of the orbit of organized crime over the years. He had worked odd jobs, including in restaurants, and had a long familiarity with card games, betting, and the unspoken codes of the street. By the time he settled in Florida, he was, by his own later account, looking for both stability and opportunity, a way to make money that drew on what he knew best. Law enforcement records and Iannuzzi's subsequent memoir agree that mutual acquaintances introduced him to Agro in Florida. To Agro, he was useful, someone with experience in gambling circles, comfortable around bookmakers and bettors, and adept at cooking and running a kitchen, skills that could be leveraged to create a congenial front for business. To Iannuzzi, Agro represented access to money and status in a world he had always hovered at the edges of. Their relationship began as a pragmatic alliance and developed into a closer association as Agro came to trust him with more responsibility. One of the ways this trust manifested was in the use of food and hospitality as a cover for criminal business. Certain restaurants and lounges in Palm Beach County served as informal headquarters for Agro's activities, places where he felt comfortable receiving visitors and holding conversations. Iannuzzi, who took pride in his cooking and his ability to entertain, helped manage some of these venues. On the surface, they were ordinary establishments serving locals and tourists. In the back rooms or after closing time, they hosted card games, quiet negotiations over debts, and discussions about how to handle reluctant borrowers. According to later testimony, Iannuzzi's role expanded from running kitchens and handling logistics to acting as a go-between. He delivered messages, picked up payments, and sometimes sat in on meetings where the terms of loans or the resolution of disputes were discussed. In that capacity, he witnessed firsthand the techniques Agro used to maintain control. These did not always involve raised voices or overt threats. Often, the most powerful messages were delivered calmly, with a reminder of past favors granted or future harm implied. Occasionally, however, Agro's temper surfaced more directly. Accounts from the period describe him as a man who could shift quickly from humor to anger if he felt he was being disrespected or deceived. Behind the scenes, law enforcement was taking note. Surveillance teams observed Agro's regular presence at certain addresses, including locations associated with Iannuzzi. Informants, whose identities have largely remained sealed, reported that Agro was a Gambino soldier overseeing gambling and loan sharking on behalf of New York interests. Arrest records from minor cases, small gambling busts, for instance, provided the legal footholds that allowed investigators to seek court orders for more intrusive techniques, such as wiretaps on pay phones and business lines used by his associates. Step by step, they were drawing closer to the inner circle. For Iannuzzi, the late 1970s were a period of both opportunity and increasing strain. Working for Agro brought in money and a sense of status, but it also exposed him to risk. He gambled himself and sometimes lost more than he could comfortably afford. Debts, both his own and those he collected for Agro, became a central element of his daily life. When he accompanied Agro or other collectors on visits to delinquent borrowers, he saw the fear in people's faces, the way livelihoods and family security could hinge on a single meeting. In his later accounts, he would describe a growing unease about the path he was on, though at the time he remained within Agro's orbit. Tensions within that orbit eventually took on a more personal dimension, as investigators reconstructed events through interviews and surveillance, and as Iannuzzi himself later recounted, small discrepancies began to appear in the money flowing through Agro's Florida operation. Sums collected did not always match sums delivered. In any cash-based business, some leakage is almost inevitable. But in the world Agro inhabited, unexplained shortfalls were not taken lightly. Suspicions arose that someone was skimming, that is, taking an extra share beyond what had been agreed upon and concealing it from superiors. Whether out of desperation, rationalization, or simple misjudgment, Iannuzzi admitted in his memoir to having diverted some funds for his own use during this period. He hoped, at least initially, that the amounts were small enough to go unnoticed, or that he could make them up over time. It was a dangerous calculation to make under a man like Agro, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the small signs of deceit in those around him. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the two men began to fray. Agro became more probing in his questions, more insistent on detailed accounting, less tolerant of what he perceived as evasiveness. Overlaying these monetary tensions was a growing paranoia about law enforcement pressure. Stories of associates turning state's evidence circulated through Underworld channels. Convictions in RICO cases up north underscored that even long-standing figures could be brought down by the testimony of former colleagues. In that atmosphere, a boss like Agro would have been constantly alert to the possibility that someone close to him was talking to the authorities. Any unexplained behavior, a sudden reluctance to participate in certain activities, an uncharacteristic nervousness could trigger suspicion. According to the official record, by 1981, the relationship between Agro and Yannuzi had deteriorated sharply. Agro appears to have become convinced that Yannuzi had not only stolen from him, but might also be in contact with law enforcement, or at least posed an unacceptable liability. What followed would become one of the most pivotal episodes in both men's lives, and a turning point in the history of Agro's operations in Florida. The incident took place in a private residence in Palm Beach County. Various accounts agree that Agro arranged for Yannuzi to come there under the pretext of discussing business and resolving outstanding issues. Once inside, instead of conversation, he was met with violence. Later court documents and Yannuzi's own descriptions are consistent on the core facts. He was physically attacked by Agro and others, beaten severely enough to leave him with serious injuries, including broken bones and lasting damage to his health. The assault was not a spontaneous barroom fight, but a deliberate act meant to punish perceived betrayal and to send a message about the consequences of crossing a Gambino soldier. The details of the beating, while recounted elsewhere, are not needed here to grasp its significance. What matters is that the private code of discipline that had sustained Agro's authority for years now produced a starkly different outcome. The man who had long relied on fear and the expectation of silence to keep victims and subordinates in line had, in this case, gone far enough that the victim chose a different path. Barely surviving the attack, hospitalized and facing a future shaped by his injuries, Joseph Yannuzi did something that, in the culture he and Agro shared, represented the ultimate break. He agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. Initially, according to investigators, he was reluctant and evasive. Decades of conditioning do not fall away easily. He worried about retaliation, about the safety of his family, about the stigma attached to informing. Agents and prosecutors, aware both of his potential value and of the danger he faced, moved cautiously. They offered protection, including the possibility of entering the federal witness protection program, and laid out how his testimony, and more importantly, his willingness to wear recording devices, could help dismantle the very structure that had allowed Agro to wield power for so long. In the end, the severity of the beating, combined with his sense of having been betrayed by a man he had served, convinced Yannuzi to cooperate fully. It was a decision that would reverberate far beyond their personal relationship. For the first time, investigators had someone from directly inside Agro's Florida operation prepared to describe, in granular detail, how it worked and to capture his words on tape. The same code of fear that had protected Agro for decades had, through its most extreme application, produced the witness who could do him the most damage. In the wake of the attack, as Agro continued to move through his familiar circuit of restaurants, racetracks, and quiet meeting spots, he was no longer operating in the same environment. Unbeknownst to him, conversations he assumed were private would soon be preserved on compact cassettes and later played in federal courtrooms. The long apprenticeship in shadowy dealings that had carried him from New York's crowded streets to a position of influence in Florida was about to collide with a new reality. An associate whose loyalty had been shattered, and a justice system that now held a key to unlocking the inner workings of his world. When he left the hospital and first agreed to speak with federal agents, Joseph Yanuzzi was stepping across a line that, in the world he and Thomas Agro shared, could not be uncrossed. For decades he had lived by an unwritten rule that whatever happened in the back rooms and private houses of the underworld stayed there. Now, bruised, in pain, and angry at the man he felt had nearly killed him, he began to tell outsiders how that world actually functioned. The early meetings took place in anonymous government offices and hotel rooms, far from the restaurants and racetracks where he had spent most of his Florida years. Agents listened more than they spoke, asking him to go over details again and again. Names, phone numbers, license plates, the layout of particular houses and businesses, the nicknames people used when they thought outsiders were not listening. Over time, a pattern emerged that matched fragments they already had from surveillance, financial records, and other informants. Where their picture had been blurry, Yanuzzi's account brought things into sharper focus. He could explain not only that Agro was meeting certain men, but why, not only that money was changing hands, but what debts or bets lay behind those transactions. Prosecutors understood that testimony alone, no matter how detailed, would not be enough. Juries could be skeptical of witnesses who had made a living in the very criminal culture they were describing. Defense attorneys would portray them as opportunists willing to say anything to save themselves. To build a case that could withstand those attacks, investigators needed something more concrete than recollections and second-hand stories. They needed contemporaneous recordings, Agro's own words, captured in real time as he carried on his business. This meant asking Yanuzzi to do more than talk. It meant asking him to walk back into Agro's world wearing a wire. He hesitated. He knew what had happened to others who were suspected of cooperating. Even if he never set foot in Florida again, the risk to his family and to anyone associated with him was serious. Agents responded by laying out the protections they could offer: relocation under new identities through the Federal Witness Protection Program, help in rebuilding a life elsewhere, security measures during the investigation and eventual trial. None of it could make the danger vanish entirely, but it made cooperation seem less like a leap into the void. In the end, a combination of factors pushed him forward: the magnitude of the beating he had endured, his sense of betrayal, his own legal exposure from years of illegal gambling and debt collection, and a grim recognition that there was no easy way back to his old life. He agreed to wear recording devices, and the Bureau began the careful process of training him. In those pre-digital years, the equipment was comparatively bulky and temperamental. Tiny microphones were sewn into clothing, wired to cassette recorders hidden under shirts or in specially constructed compartments. Agents drilled Yanuzzi in how to test the devices without drawing attention, how to position himself to capture voices clearly, and how to remain calm if someone patted him down or became suspicious. They rehearsed likely scenarios, Agro asking where he'd been, demanding explanations, probing for signs of disloyalty. At the same time, prosecutors had to choreograph the legal side. Each recording session required authorization. They had to show judges there was probable cause to believe that conversations involving Agro would relate to specific offenses: extortionate credit transactions, collection of unlawful debts, gambling violations, and potentially racketeering under RICO. Orders were time-limited, subject to renewal only if agents could demonstrate that the surveillance was producing useful evidence not available by less intrusive means. The bureaucracy was heavy, but these safeguards were what would later allow the tapes to be played in court. According to later accounts from both law enforcement and Yanuzzi himself, the first wired meetings were fraught. Agro had every reason to be suspicious. He knew that he had ordered a severe beating of a man who had worked closely with him. He knew law enforcement attention in Florida was intensifying. When Yanuzzi reappeared, still showing signs of his injuries but eager to talk about straightening things out, Agro probed for inconsistencies. Why had he spoken to the police after the assault? What exactly had he told them? Did he intend to bring charges? Yannuzi, following the script hammered out with agents, framed his contacts with law enforcement as unavoidable, something that had happened while he was unconscious or medicated, something he regretted and had tried to minimize. The tapes from those early encounters, later described in court, captured a revealing mix of distrust and lingering familiarity. Agro questioned, tested, and occasionally lashed out verbally, but he did not sever the relationship. Perhaps he believed that keeping Yannuzi close would allow him to control potential damage. Perhaps he could not easily give up a man who had, for years, been useful in running kitchens, organizing social gatherings, and smoothing over disputes. Whatever his reasoning, he continued to meet with him, and with each meeting, the government's evidence grew. Over the following months, Yannuzi's recordings documented not only personal exchanges between the two men, but the broader machinery of Agro's Florida rackets. In restaurants and cars, on walks to and from racetracks, Agro discussed loans, collections, and bets. He evaluated the reliability of particular borrowers, weighed whether to extend more credit, and decided how hard to press those in arrears. In some conversations, his tone was matter of fact, treating high-interest loans like any other business. In others, he edged into more explicit reminders of the consequences of non-payment, invoking the Gambino name or alluding darkly to what happened to people who forgot who they were dealing with. To avoid broadcasting the most sensitive aspects of their operation in public spaces, Agro often spoke in coded language or shorthand, but to someone like Yannuzi, steeped in the same subculture, the meaning was clear, and he could decode it for agents in post-meeting debriefings. When Agro mentioned creating more heat on a debtor, for example, he was not talking about a thermostat. When he spoke of helping somebody remember what they owe, he was not referring to a friendly reminder. These interpretations, combined with the surrounding context captured on tape, gave prosecutors the foundation to argue that his words had an intimidating intent, even when he didn't spell out specific acts. The recordings also confirmed a point investigators had long suspected. Agro saw himself not as an independent entrepreneur, but as a representative of a larger organization. He referred to our people in New York, to superiors whose approval was needed for certain decisions, and to the necessity of keeping the Florida venture profitable and orderly so that it would reflect well on the family. He discussed trips north, conversations with unnamed friends and cousins who were clearly something more than relatives. While he avoided explicitly nomming higher-ranking figures on tape, a habit drilled into him over years in the life, his manner of speaking left little doubt that he operated within a structured hierarchy. As the tapes accumulated, agents cross-checked what they heard against telephone records, surveillance logs, and the statements of other informants. A call mentioned in one conversation could be matched to a toll record showing a connection between Agro's known number and another subject of interest. A meeting arranged over coffee could be observed from a distance by surveillance teams, who noted license plates and photographs. In this way, the recordings did not stand alone. They became the backbone of a larger evidentiary web. For Agro, the late months of those recording sessions must have felt, on the surface, like a return to some semblance of normalcy. He continued to do what he had always done, visiting his usual haunts, taking bets, evaluating loans, and keeping a wary eye on both customers and associates. There is no evidence that he suspected the degree to which his words were being captured and cataloged. The very familiarity of his routines, meeting in places he controlled, talking to people he knew, may have lulled him into a sense that whatever had happened with Yannuzi, he had managed to contain the fallout. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were moving toward indictment. Federal grand juries in South Florida heard testimony from agents, financial analysts, and cooperating witnesses. They reviewed transcripts and listened to selected portions of the tapes, guided through the coded language by people who had lived within that lexicon. The government's theory was straightforward: that Agro had participated in and directed a criminal enterprise engaged in the collection of unlawful debts and in extortionate credit transactions, using the reputation and implied backing of the Gambino crime family to instill fear and ensure payment. When the indictment finally came, it did so with the weight of years of investigation behind it. Agro and several associates were charged under federal statutes that targeted not just isolated episodes of intimidation or illegal lending, but patterns of racketeering activity. The charges included counts of using extortionate means to collect extensions of credit and operating an illegal gambling business, as well as conspiracy charges that tied those acts together as part of a continuing scheme. For the first time, Agro's name appeared in major newspapers not as a shadowy figure in law enforcement reports, but as a defendant in a high-profile federal case. Arrest was not a dramatic takedown. By this point, Agro was older, and his health had begun to show signs of strain. He surrendered through his attorney, was processed, and released on bail while awaiting trial, conditions that reflected both the non-spectacular nature of the charges, financial crimes rather than headline-grabbing violence, and the court's assessment of his flight risk. He returned to his home in Florida under a cloud of restrictions, travel limitations, orders not to contact certain known associates, and the knowledge that his movements might be monitored. Meanwhile, preparations for trial accelerated. Prosecutors had to organize a mountain of evidence into a coherent narrative that a jury of laypeople could understand. They created charts illustrating how money flowed through Agro's operation, how bets were placed and settled, how loans were extended and collected. They cataloged each tape, identifying key excerpts that demonstrated not only the existence of illegal activity, but Agro's central role in directing it. They anticipated defense arguments, that the loans were between friends, that any harsh words were merely bluster, that the recordings were ambiguous or taken out of context, and that the government's star witness, Joseph Iannuzzi, was unreliable. Defense attorneys, for their part, dug into Iannuzzi's history, preparing to paint him as an opportunist and liar. They gathered records of his prior arrests, his known involvement in illegal gambling, his own admitted theft from Agro's operation. Their strategy was to make him the story, to convince jurors that nothing said in his presence could be trusted, that he had every incentive to embroider or misrepresent events in order to secure favorable treatment from the government. If they could persuade at least one juror that the tapes were contaminated by entrapment, or that Iannuzzi had goaded Agro into intemperate language he did not mean, they might secure acquittal or at least a hung jury. The courtroom where their conflict would play out was a far cry from the dimly lit spaces where most of Agro's business had been conducted. Brightly lit, ringed with polished wood, it imposed a different set of rules. Everything would be recorded, but now by official court reporters rather than hidden devices. Any coded language would be dissected not in back hallways but in open court, with jurors watching. The hierarchy that had once given Agro power, his status as a Gambino soldier, his reputation for making problems disappear, was inverted. Here, those same facts would be used to frame him as a dangerous figure whose words carried implied menace. When the trial began, the prosecution opened with a straightforward account. This case, they said, was about money and fear. They described retirees and small business owners who had been lured or pushed into taking high-interest loans when they were vulnerable, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle where payments barely touched the principal, and the pressure to pay on time increased relentlessly. They explained that the law did not require broken bones or overt threats to constitute extortion. It required proof that the debtor reasonably feared economic or reputational harm if he failed to pay, and that the lender intended to exploit that fear. Then they began calling witnesses. Some were law enforcement officers who described surveillance, record keeping, and the mechanics of the investigation. Others were borrowers or bettors who had dealt with Agro's operation, though often at arm's length. Nervous on the stand, they recounted conversations with intermediaries, occasional encounters with Agro himself, and the steady tightening of demands when they fell behind. The central witness, however, was the man whose journey from associate to informant had made the case possible. When Joseph Yanuzzi took the stand, he brought with him his complex history, a lifetime on the fringes of organized crime, his role in running kitchens and handling collections for Agro, his thefts, his beating, and his decision to cooperate. Before the defense could attack his character, the prosecution brought much of it out themselves. They had him admit to his crimes, to his gambling, even to his betrayals. The goal was not to present him as virtuous, it was to present him as credible. Yes, he said, he had broken the law. Yes, he had lied in the past. But the events he was now describing were backed by tapes the jury would hear for themselves. As the cassettes clicked and spun on the court's playback equipment, the room listened to a different voice, Thomas Agro's, captured in the restaurants, cars, and homes where he had felt secure. In some excerpts, he discussed bets and collections in an almost casual way, using the jargon of bookmakers. In others, he spoke more sharply about debtors who were falling behind, about teaching people a lesson, about making sure that no one thought they could take advantage of him or the people he represented. He did not need to describe physical harm for the effect to be clear. The tone, the context, and the reactions of those he spoke to all conveyed that these were not idle remarks. Defense attorneys cross-examined Yanuzzi vigorously. They questioned his motives, suggesting that he was inventing or exaggerating details to please his handlers. They highlighted his financial troubles and the benefits he had received for cooperating, including relocation and assistance from the government. They asked whether he had goaded Agro into saying things he would not otherwise have said, whether the situation amounted to entrapment. On cross-examination, they tried to force him into contradictions, to shake his composure in front of the jury. Yet the tapes limited how far those strategies could go. Where a typical informant story might hinge entirely on memory, here jurors could replay key conversations, compare them with what Yanuzzi claimed was happening around them, and decide for themselves whether his interpretation rang true. Moreover, the government buttressed his testimony with other evidence. Toll records confirming calls mentioned on the tapes, bank records showing large, unexplained cash movements, the testimony of other borrowers whose accounts echoed the patterns heard in the recordings. Throughout the trial, Agro sat at the defense table, his appearance a reminder of the passage of time. He was no longer the younger man building a reputation in New York's enclaves or establishing footholds in Florida. Age and illness had marked him. Press reports from the time noted that he sometimes appeared weary, that he conferred quietly with his attorneys but made no dramatic outbursts. Whatever he thought of Yanuzzi's betrayal, he kept it behind a carefully neutral expression. The code of silence that had governed his life still applied, even as that code's erosion in others had led him here. In closing arguments, prosecutors returned to their central theme. This case, they told jurors, was not a Hollywood mob story. There were no car chases, no sensational assassinations. It was about a quieter, more pervasive form of harm, the exploitation of fear and vulnerability for profit. They argued that Agro had chosen a life in which the threat of retaliation, sometimes implied, sometimes acted upon, was a tool of trade, and that the law held him accountable for the way he used that tool in Florida. The defense urged jurors to look past the aura of organized crime, to see instead a man whose words, while sometimes harsh, had been taken out of context and filtered through the perspective of a self-serving informant. They reminded the jury of the burden of proof, insisting that any reasonable doubt about Agro's intent or about the voluntary nature of the loans should result in acquittal. The jurors withdrew to deliberate with stacks of transcripts, their memories of live testimony, and the sound of taped voices echoing in their minds. When they returned, Their verdict would help define not only the trajectory of Thomas Agro's remaining years, but also the broader effort to curtail the reach of northern organized crime into states like Florida. The jury did not stay out long enough for anyone in the courtroom to relax. After hours rather than days, word came that a verdict had been reached. People filtered back to their seats. Agents who had spent years piecing together the case, reporters with notebooks open, a scattering of local residents curious enough to sit through the closing acts of a trial that had peeled back the surface of their own communities. At the defense table, Thomas Agro rose with the rest as the jurors filed in. The clerk read out the findings count by count. On the core charges, extortionate collection of credit, conspiracy, and operating an illegal gambling business, the answer was the same: guilty. Contemporary press reports noted that Agro showed little outward reaction, standing impassively as the words were spoken. Whatever churn of anger, denial, or resignation moved within him remained contained behind the practiced stillness of a man who had learned, long ago, that visible emotion in public was a liability. When the judge thanked and dismissed the jurors, when the shuffle of feet and low voices resumed, he sat again beside his lawyers, technically still. Free man on bond, but now a convicted racketeer awaiting sentence. For those who had testified against him, particularly borrowers and small business owners who had spoken haltingly about their dealings with his operation, the verdict brought a complex mix of relief and lingering unease. Some had doubted that a jury would believe people who admitted to gambling or taking illegal loans. Others feared that, conviction or not, the organization behind Agro would find ways to punish them quietly once the cameras moved on. Agents and prosecutors tried to reassure them. Sentencing, they said, would be severe, and safeguards were in place. Yet the habits of caution formed under years of pressure did not disappear overnight. In the weeks between verdict and sentencing, pre-sentence investigators compiled reports on Agro's life, his age, his health, his prior record, his family circumstances. Unlike some of the mob figures who graced front pages in New York, little was publicly known about his private world. He had been married, raised children, maintained a household that, from the outside, could have belonged to any middle-aged man of modest means in South Florida. Neighbors saw him come and go, exchange pleasantries, mow a lawn. The report noted his lack of formal education beyond high school, his long history of self-employment in the vaguest sense. It also cataloged prior arrests and intelligence assessments tying him to the Gambino family. Federal sentencing in that era gave judges considerable discretion. Guidelines were advisory, not mandatory, and a judge could consider both the letter of the law and the broader social context when deciding on punishment. At Agro's sentencing hearing, prosecutors argued for a substantial term of incarceration. They emphasized the calculated nature of his crimes. This was not a one-time loss of temper or a single bad decision, but a sustained pattern of exploiting fear for financial gain. Defense attorneys pushed back, pointing to his age, then in his early 50s, and to medical issues that were beginning to intrude on his life. They portrayed him as a man whose health was deteriorating, whose capacity to reoffend would diminish over time. The judge, reviewing the evidence and the statutory ranges, chose to side with the government on the need for a strong deterrent. According to contemporaneous news accounts, he sentenced Agro to 15 years in federal prison and imposed a fine, underscoring that involvement in organized crime's quieter rackets, gambling and loan sharking, would be treated with the same seriousness as more overtly violent offenses. In pronouncing sentence, he noted that while no one had died as a direct result of Agro's Florida operations, the atmosphere of intimidation they fostered had corroded trust in legal institutions and trapped vulnerable people in cycles of debt. Legally, the case was not quite over. Agro's lawyers filed appeals, challenging aspects of the trial, the admission of certain tape recordings, the use of Yannuzi as a government agent after his beating, the judge's instructions to the jury on what constituted extortion under federal law. They argued that some loan arrangements had been between friends and associates, that harsh words had been taken as threats when they were, in their telling, merely bluster. They suggested that the government had overreached in turning a long-standing social relationship into a federal crime. The appellate court was not persuaded. Reviewing the record, including the tapes and the testimony of multiple borrowers, a panel of judges concluded that the evidence supported the jury's verdict. The repeated references to the Gambino family, the consistent pattern of high-interest loans and escalating pressure, and the clear indication that borrowers feared serious consequences if they fell behind all pointed, in the court's view, to extortionate intent. The conviction and sentence were upheld. What had begun as an investigation in the dim light of backroom conversations had now been ratified at every level of the federal system. For the Bureau of Prisons, Agro presented a particular challenge. By the time his appeals were exhausted and he began serving his sentence in earnest, his health had worsened significantly. Years of heavy smoking and hard living had taken their toll. Reports from journalists and later writers indicate that he had developed an aggressive cancer of the mouth and jaw, a disease that would ultimately define his final years. Treatment required repeated hospitalizations and, eventually, major surgery that left him disfigured and struggling to speak. Photographs from this period, where they exist, show a man physically diminished, his once compact frame thinner, his features altered by illness. Because of these medical needs, Agro was not sent to an ordinary penitentiary. Instead, he was assigned to a federal medical facility, one of the specialized institutions the Bureau maintained for inmates requiring intensive health care. There he lived in a hybrid environment, part hospital, part prison. Guards monitored the halls, routines were regulated, yet the daily life of the place revolved around doctors' rounds, treatment schedules, and the quiet business of coping with serious illness. For a man whose adult identity had been bound up with command, with the ability to make others bend to his will, the enforced passivity of the medical ward must have felt like an alien world. Even in that constrained environment, he did not vanish from the calculations of law enforcement. Investigators and prosecutors in New York, pursuing broader cases against the Gambino family and other organized crime groups, remained aware of him. The early to mid-1980 were marked by a series of landmark prosecutions. The so-called Commission case in Manhattan, which targeted the collective leadership of the major New York families, labor racketeering cases involving unions and construction, and efforts to dismantle other regional operations like the one Agro had run in Florida. Each new witness who came forward, each intercepted conversation, helped map a network in which Agro still appeared as one node, even if his ability to influence events had been sharply curtailed by incarceration and illness. Back in Florida, the void left by his removal did not remain empty. Illegal gambling and high-interest lending did not cease overnight. Other figures, some with ties to the same New York families, others more loosely connected, stepped in to serve persistent demand. Yet the era in which a single Gambino soldier could operate with relative impunity in Palm Beach County was over. The highly publicized nature of Agro's case, the courage of witnesses like Iannuzzi, and the demonstrated willingness of federal authorities to commit resources to long investigations had altered the risk calculus. Fewer local business owners were inclined to shrug off the presence of out-of-state investors with vague backgrounds. Some who might previously have suffered in silence were more willing to pick up the phone. For Joseph Iannuzzi, the years after the trial unfolded on a very different stage. Entered into the Federal Witness Protection Program, he moved under a new identity to a location far from the Florida streets and New York neighborhoods he had known. The program provided a measure of safety, but it also imposed loss. He left behind friends, familiar haunts, and the loose social networks that had defined his adult life. He had to find work that fit his skills yet did not expose him publicly. The government could offer a stipend and assistance, but not the sense of belonging that the underworld, for all its dangers, had once provided. Over time, he began to talk publicly about his experiences, first through interviews and then in print. In a memoir and in media appearances, he described Agro as both mentor and tormentor, the man who had given him a place in the Gambino-linked operation, and the man whose decision to order a brutal assault had pushed him into the arms of law enforcement. He did not romanticize the life. He spoke frankly about the harm he himself had helped inflict, and about the corrosive effect of living by a code that prized silence over conscience. For historians and journalists, his account became one of the primary sources for understanding Agro's methods and the Florida crew's day-to-day realities. Agro, by contrast, never told his own story. There are no interviews, no prison letters published in the press, no memoir dictated from a hospital bed. His perspective survives only indirectly, in the way he spoke on tape about money, loyalty, and fear, in the terse exchanges recorded in court transcripts, and in the recollections of those who encountered him. Some recalled flashes of humor and a capacity for charm. Others remembered only the coldness in his eyes when debts were discussed. Without his own narrative, any attempt to reconstruct his inner life must be cautious. He remained, to the end, committed to a culture that regarded explanation as weakness. As his cancer advanced, questions arose about whether he should remain in custody. Federal law allowed for compassionate release in extraordinary cases, particularly when an inmate was terminally ill and no longer posed a threat. Reports from the period suggest that Agro did, eventually, receive some form of medical clemency, being permitted to leave a federal facility for treatment and palliative care outside its walls. The details, exact dates, specific conditions, are scattered across court records and press accounts, but the broad outline is clear. The man who had once leveraged fear to keep others in line spent his last months under the shadow of a disease no one could intimidate. He died in 1987, at the age of 56, his body worn down by cancer. His passing did not attract major headlines. There were no front-page obituaries in national papers, no public funeral gatherings reported by the mainstream press. In the insular world of the Gambino family, news of his death would have circulated quietly. A soldier lost, a Florida operation long since compromised, another reminder of how the combination of law enforcement pressure and human frailty was thinning the ranks of an organization that had once seemed untouchable. For the people whose lives had intersected with his in Florida, the bettors who had handed over envelopes of cash in back rooms, the borrowers who had lain awake at night dreading a knock on the door, the small-town detectives who had watched his comings and goings from unmarked cars, his death carried different meanings. Some felt a measure of closure. The man whose name had loomed in their private anxieties was gone, and whatever lingering fear they had of retribution tied specifically to him could ease. Others, particularly those still wrestling with debts or habits formed under his watch, saw it as a largely symbolic event. The structures that had allowed someone like him to flourish, demand for illegal gambling, gaps in the legal credit system, the mystique of organized crime, remained, even if their most immediate embodiment in Palm Beach County had departed. In New York, the mid to late 1980s were reshaping the Gambino family in ways that put Agro's story into a broader frame. Paul Castellano, the boss whose tenure had overlapped with Agro's Florida operations, was assassinated in 1985 outside a Manhattan steakhouse, a killing widely attributed to an internal power struggle that elevated John Gotti. The commission case had sent leaders of several families to long prison terms. Under media glare, mob trials and mob hits captured public imagination, reinforcing a cinematic image of organized crime that bore only partial overlap with the quieter extortion schemes that had marked Agro's career. Yet for law enforcement professionals who had worked the Florida case, his conviction and eventual death represented something more grounded, a demonstration that the tools developed in the 1970s and early 1980s, RICO statutes, coordinated strike forces, careful cultivation of insiders like Iannuzzi, could penetrate even far-flung corners of the mafia's empire. The lesson was not that organized crime could be eradicated overnight, but that its most entrenched figures were no longer beyond reach simply because they operated behind the facade of neighborhood familiarity, or in states once considered peripheral to the New York family's core interests. In the end, the arc of Thomas Agro's life traced a path that mirrored the rise and gradual constriction of traditional American organized crime in the mid-20th century. He emerged from ethnic enclaves where distrust of formal institutions gave space to informal protectors. He built a career in gambling and high-interest lending at a time when such activities were widespread and often lightly policed. He extended his reach to a booming Sunbelt state, riding the wave of demographic change that carried northern habits southward. And he was ultimately brought down not by a dramatic shootout or a sudden, rogue betrayal, but by a long, meticulous legal process that turned the methods of his own world, coded conversations, personal loyalties, into evidence against him. The man himself left little behind in the public record beyond court files and the memories of those who knew him. No charitable foundations carry his name. No public buildings commemorate his existence. His legacy survives instead as a cautionary thread in the larger tapestry of American criminal history, a reminder of how power and fear can entangle ordinary desires for entertainment, for credit, for a bit of extra cash, and of how the systems that sustain such power, once taken for granted, can be unmade by the testimony of those who have lived inside them and chosen. At last to speak. In the months and years after Thomas Agro was sentenced, and then quietly left the stage through illness and death, his case continued to ripple through the institutions that had pursued him and the communities where he had once held sway. For federal agents and prosecutors, those Florida tapes and the conviction they produced became a kind of template, proof that you could dismantle a regional arm of a powerful New York crime family without relying on a spectacular headline crime. It was enough, they argued in internal reports and training sessions, to show the slow grind of intimidation, the loaded way a name like Gambino was dropped into a conversation, the phone calls that came every week, the knowledge that a missed payment did not simply vanish. New investigators coming into organized crime squads in the late 1980s were walked through the Agro case, the way a young doctor might be led through a set of classic symptoms. Here was how a crew embedded itself in a transplanted community. Here was how it used local businesses as both cover and contact points. Here was how a seemingly minor figure, a man who ran kitchens and kitchens' back doors, could, under the right circumstances, pull the entire operation into the light. The lesson was not just tactical. It spoke to a broader shift in how law enforcement understood the mafia. Gone was the illusion that you could simply decapitate a family by jailing its most famous leaders and expect the street-level rackets to wither on their own. Men like Agro, working far from the traditional strongholds, revealed how adaptable the old structures could be. In Florida itself, the case strengthened the hand of those in local law enforcement who had long argued that northern organized crime groups were more than a rumor. For years, sheriffs and detectives who talked about New York guys taking bets in their jurisdictions had been met, in some political circles, with skepticism or even irritation. Such talk, it was feared, could hurt tourism or real estate values. The televised images of a convicted Gambino soldier being led in and out of a federal courthouse in West Palm Beach, and the public acknowledgement by the Justice Department that this was indeed a Florida arm of a New York enterprise, made denial harder to sustain. That did not mean the gambling stopped. It did not mean the loan sharking stopped, but it did change the environment in which those activities took place. Some operators withdrew, deciding that Florida had become too hot. Others shifted tactics, using more layers of intermediaries, moving meetings more frequently, keeping less written evidence. A few, sensing opportunity in the vacuum left by Agro's removal, tried to step into his old role, only to find that the combination of wary potential customers and emboldened police made the job far more precarious than it had been a decade earlier. At the national level, the timing of Agro's downfall placed him in the middle of a wider transformation. His Florida empire was being disassembled just as the old order in New York was convulsing. When Paul Castellano was murdered in 1985 and John Gotti rose to the top of the Gambino family, the public's attention was drawn to the glitzy, media-savvy world of Manhattan social clubs and tabloid-worthy trials. Gotti's eventual conviction in 1992 on racketeering and murder charges, propelled by the testimony of his former underboss Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, seemed to many observers like a final blow against the mythic mafia of mid-century America. Yet for agents who had worked cases like Agro's, the lesson was more nuanced. They had seen that the real damage caused by organized crime often lay not in marquee acts of violence, but in the everyday exploitation of weakness. A gambler who slowly lost his savings. A small business owner who signed away a stake in his livelihood to escape a debt. A family who lived for years under the strain of payments that never seemed to reduce the principal. In training seminars and internal memos, they urged colleagues and successors not to be distracted by the high-profile New York trials alone. The long-term health of communities like those in Palm Beach County depended on disrupting the quieter rackets as well. For Joseph Iannuzzi, watching this play out from the relative safety of a new life, the changing climate must have carried its own complicated charge. He had entered witness protection at a time when cooperating with the government was still, in underworld culture, an almost unthinkable breach. By the early 1990s, as case after case was built on the testimony of former insiders, that breach had become, if not common, then at least familiar. Men higher in the hierarchy than he had ever reached, capos and even underbosses, took the stand against their former colleagues. Each time it happened, the aura of unbreakable loyalty that had once shielded families like the Gambinos dimmed a little more. Under his assumed identity, Iannuzzi tried to fashion a different sort of livelihood. The skills that had made him useful to Agro, his ability to cook for large numbers of people, to run a kitchen efficiently, to create a sense of conviviality around a table, were in themselves not criminal. They could be put to work in restaurants, catering businesses, or, eventually, in publishing. When he began to write about his life, he did so through the lens he knew best: food. His cookbook, with its mixture of recipes and anecdotes from his years around the Gambino crew, became a minor cultural phenomenon in the 1990s. Readers were drawn by the frisson of mob cuisine, but many also encountered, between instructions for sauce and sausage, stark reminders of the coercive world those meals had accompanied. In interviews promoting the book and later memoirs, he did not conceal the cost of that world. He described the beating that had nearly ended his life, the operations and long recovery, the nightmares that lingered. He spoke about the fear that had driven him into witness protection and the guilt he felt both for his years of participation and for the friends he had effectively condemned by testifying. Agro appeared in these accounts as a complex figure, sometimes generous, sometimes jovial, but fundamentally dangerous. A man who could, and did, decide that an associate's life was expendable when money and suspicion intersected. These narratives, for all their drama, also contributed to a gradual demystification of figures like Agro. By the early 21st century, the image of the mobster in American culture had shifted again. Television dramas and films portrayed bosses and soldiers as flawed, often miserable men, juggling domestic troubles with illicit business, more often shown in therapists' offices than in stylized shootouts. Against this backdrop, Agro's career, as reconstructed by court records and insider accounts, looked less like the arc of a criminal mastermind and more like the story of a mid-tier enforcer and organizer, dangerous in his domain, certainly, but ultimately boxed in by forces larger than himself. Demographic change, evolving law enforcement, and his own biological vulnerability. For scholars studying organized crime, his Florida years offered a case study in what happened when the old urban syndicates tried to graft themselves onto fast-growing Sunbelt regions. In academic articles and doctoral dissertations, criminologists mapped the intersection of three trends: the migration of retirees and workers from northern cities, the slow expansion of legal gambling through state lotteries and regulated casinos, and the parallel persistence of illegal bookmakers and loan sharks. Agro's operation sat at that crossroads. He exploited the nostalgia of transplanted New Yorkers for the betting patterns of their youth, a phone call to a familiar kind of character, instead of a trip to a sterile betting parlor. And he filled credit gaps that mainstream banks still considered too risky or too small to bother with. Those same scholars also highlighted the role of regulatory and social change in undermining such businesses. As states introduced lotteries and later authorized casino or expanded pari-mutuel wagering, a portion of the betting public that had once relied on backroom bookmakers shifted to legal channels. The attraction of those channels was not just legality, it was perceived fairness and the reduction of fear. You might still lose your money at a slot machine or a lottery kiosk, but you did not go home worrying that someone linked to a New York crime family would appear at your door if you failed to settle up. Similarly, the growth of legitimate, heavily regulated consumer credit, including credit cards, home equity loans, and, later, online lending, gave many small business owners and individuals alternatives to the kind of high-interest cash that Agro had purveyed. That did not eliminate predatory lending or debt traps. They resurfaced in other guises. But it did narrow the specific niche on which traditional loan sharking had long depended: people with few or no legal options for short-term credit. In Florida, the story of organized crime in the decades after Agro's death became increasingly entangled with another criminal economy: narcotics. Miami and other urban centers were transformed in the 1980s by the influx of cocaine and the violent conflicts that accompanied it. Colombian and later Mexican cartels, along with domestic trafficking networks, dominated headlines and law enforcement priorities. Compared to the bloody, high-volume drug wars unfolding on city streets and in suburban cul-de-sacs, the activities of aging bookmakers and loan sharks seemed almost antiquated. And yet, in the quieter corners of the state, vestiges of Agro's world persisted. FBI and state investigative reports from the late 1980s and 1990s still listed suspected associates of northern families living in coastal condo complexes, playing cards in private rooms, running small betting operations among friends. These were rarely the subject of large, multi-year strike force investigations. Resources were pulled toward drugs, public corruption, and white-collar fraud. But every so often, a raid on an illegal gambling room or a tax evasion case would bring up names that had once appeared beside Agro's in older files. The continuity was there, if thinner, a reminder that some criminal habits are remarkably durable. The legal framework that had brought Agro down continued to evolve as well. Courts refined their interpretations of what constituted extortionate credit transactions, wrestling with the line between harsh but legal collection practices and those that crossed into exploiting fear of non-economic harm. Defense attorneys cited Agro-era cases when arguing that mere references to a defendant's reputation or associations should not, by themselves, satisfy the statute. Prosecutors countered that, in communities where organized crime influence was well known, those reputations were the very currency of coercion. The witness protection program that had sheltered Yanuzi also came under scrutiny. Congressional hearings and media investigations in the 1980s and 1990s raised questions about how well relocated witnesses were monitored, how effectively the government balanced their safety with the needs of the communities they joined, and whether some cooperators received leniency disproportionate to their own crimes. Supporters of the program pointed to cases like Agro. In response, without the ability to promise long-term protection, they argued men like Yanuzi could never safely testify, and deeply embedded criminal structures would remain beyond reach. Each high-risk witness who survived long enough to see his testimony lead to convictions was held up as vindication of the program's core logic. In reconstructing Agro's life for documentary audiences today, one of the persistent challenges is balancing granular detail with ethical distance. The danger of telling any story rooted in organized crime is that focus on the perpetrators can eclipse the experiences of those they harmed. To avoid that, historians and filmmakers have turned increasing attention to the voices that, in earlier eras, often went unheard. The shopkeeper who took a loan to replace a broken refrigeration unit and then spent years scrambling to cover weekly payments. The retiree whose quiet betting habits spiraled under the weight of easy credit. The spouse who watched a partner grow withdrawn and secretive, sensing a mounting financial crisis, but unable to name it. In interviews recorded long after the fact, some of these individuals spoke of Agro's operation with a mixture of lingering fear and almost anthropological curiosity. They described his demeanor, the way he would crack a joke before sliding into business, the way he let silence stretch during a negotiation, making the other person fill it with concessions. They recalled the strange duality of seeing him in ordinary settings, standing in line at the supermarket, chatting with neighbors, while also knowing that his approval or displeasure could shape their economic futures. A few expressed a reluctant gratitude toward the agents and prosecutors who had, in their view, removed a constant pressure from their lives. Others wondered whether, had legal support for small business or problem gambling been more robust, they might never have ended up sitting across from him in the first place. That last observation points to a broader lesson policymakers have drawn from cases like Agro's. The most effective long-term responses to organized crime often lie not just in criminal statutes and aggressive investigations, but in the less dramatic work of strengthening legitimate institutions. When banks are encouraged and required to serve underserved communities, when credit counseling and legal aid are accessible, when gambling addiction is treated as a public health issue rather than a private shame, the pool of people vulnerable to exploitation by illegal lenders and bookmakers shrinks. In that sense, the story of Agro's Florida years is also a story about the gaps he slipped into. Gaps in trust, in services, in social support. Looking back across his life from this vantage point, a certain pattern resolves itself. Born into a world where formal institutions were often distant or distrusted, he found his niche in informal systems of credit and risk. He leveraged his comfort with those systems to ride demographic waves south, inserting himself into the lives of people who, for many reasons, were reluctant to seek help from banks or courts. For a time, he thrived in that role, insulated by fear and by the general invisibility of his work to the larger public. But as the state caught up, through laws like RICO, through coordinated strike forces, through programs that persuaded insiders to talk, that insulation failed. Illness then did what even the most determined prosecutor could not. It set an unalterable limit on his capacity to adapt or rebuild. The closing chapters of his story, played out in hospital wards and quiet, monitored rooms rather than in dramatic confrontations, underscore that reality. For all the mythology that still clings to mafia figures in popular culture, the day-to-day lives of men like Agro often ended not in cinematic shootouts, but in the same frailties that overtake millions of ordinary people. Disease, aging, the slow erosion of options. The difference lay in what they left behind. In his case, the legacy is written not on plaques or buildings, but in case law and training manuals, in the memories of investigators and the cautionary tales told to young agents, and in the lives of those who, having once feared him, watched from a distance as the system he had relied on to shield him crumbled under the weight of its own methods. By the time news of Thomas Agro's death filtered through law enforcement circles and the shrinking fraternity of old-line mob figures, the shape of his life had already hardened into something that would never again change. But for everyone outside that small world, his story remained and remains, a puzzle assembled from fragments. There is no trove of letters, no stash of personal diaries, no long jailhouse interviews in which he reflects on the choices that carried him from New York streets to a federal medical ward. To reconstruct his path, historians, journalists, and documentary makers have had to work the way investigators did, from the outside in. The most detailed, and in some ways most problematic, fragments come from the one man who was both closest to him and ultimately most responsible for his exposure, Joseph Iannuzzi. In the years after he entered witness protection and testified against Agro and others, Iannuzzi set about telling his own version of events. He did it first informally, in conversations with agents and reporters, and then formally in a series of books. One of them, a hybrid of recipes and reminiscence, wrapped memories of dinners and late-night meals around glimpses of the Florida crew. Agro stopping by a kitchen to taste a sauce, complimenting a dish, shifting seamlessly into talk of loans and collections. Later works focused more directly on his trajectory from hopeful associate to battered victim to government witness. For anyone trying to understand Agro, these accounts are invaluable and treacherous in equal measure. They offer texture that official documents cannot. The timbre of Agro's voice when he joked, the way he chose a table in a restaurant, the small rituals that governed his day. But they are also shaped by the author's own needs, legal, psychological, financial. Iannuzzi had reasons to emphasize his own reluctance, to cast himself as more a bystander than an enthusiastic participant in crimes, to highlight Agro's ruthlessness at points where their interests diverged. Responsible historians read those pages the way investigators listened to informants, taking them seriously, but never alone. Set alongside Iannuzzi's narrative are the dry, standardized forms of the federal bureaucracy, FBI memoranda summarizing interviews, surveillance logs, grand jury transcripts, pre-sentence reports, appellate decisions. In those pages, Agro appears in brief, unembellished strokes. One memo might note him meeting a known bookmaker at a specific restaurant on a specific date. Another might summarize a confidential source's assertion that Agro, Thomas aka Tommy Agro, is a made member of the Gambino family assigned to oversee gambling and loans in the Palm Beach area. Court transcripts reproduce his recorded words with brackets indicating inaudible moments or overlapping speech. Appeals court decisions reduce years of life to a handful of legal issues and a final judgment. We find the evidence sufficient. Newspapers of the period fill in some of the visual frame. The Palm Beach Post, the Miami Herald, and Wire Services carried short articles when he was indicted, when the trial began, and when the verdict was announced. The language was matter of fact, almost terse. One article referred to him as a New York mob soldier transplanted to South Florida. Another described him as a reputed member of the Gambino crime family, accused of running a loan sharking and illegal gambling ring that preyed on small businessmen and compulsive bettors. For local readers, these pieces confirmed what many had heard as rumor, that the men sitting in certain booths or lingering a little too long over coffee were tied to something larger than a neighborhood card game. Occasionally, a reporter dug deeper. Feature stories during and after the trial profiled the investigators, detailed the mechanics of the wiretaps, and in more cautious terms, sketched Agro's background. They noted that he had long been on the radar of organized crime units in New York, that he was believed to answer to figures high in the Gambino. hierarchy, and that his Florida crew had been under intermittent observation for years before the beating of Iannuzzi gave prosecutors the opening they needed. Even then, much of the personal detail was missing. He was described in physical terms: short, stocky, dark-haired, later gaunt from illness. But quotes from him were limited to the narrow statements he or his lawyers made outside court, declarations of innocence, assertions that the government's witnesses were liars. This imbalance between a relatively voiceless subject and a talkative set of observers creates a challenge for anyone trying to tell his story responsibly. In the absence of his own account, it is tempting to fill the gaps with speculation, to imagine motives and internal conflicts. But if the goal is historical accuracy, restraint is essential. What can be said with confidence is rooted in verifiable actions, and in the patterns his life shares with those of other men who occupied similar roles in the American mafia. To place Agro in that larger pattern, you have to zoom out to the evolution of the Gambino family itself. The organization that ultimately claimed him as a soldier did not spring fully formed from the streets of mid-century New York. Its roots stretch back to the early 20th century, to waves of Sicilian immigration, and to the violent consolidation of local gangs during and after Prohibition. By the time Carlo Gambino rose to the top in the late 1950s, the family that bore his name had inherited both a criminal infrastructure and a set of unwritten rules: secrecy, discipline, a hierarchical chain of command that ran from boss to underboss to captains to soldiers to associates. Within that structure, a soldier like Agro had a clear place and clear obligations. He was expected to generate income, to obey orders passed down through his captain, and to resolve problems, both internal disputes and external resistance, without drawing unnecessary law enforcement attention. In return, he received access to capital, the protection of a powerful name, and a degree of autonomy within his assigned territory. He could authorize certain deals, decide how to handle individual debtors, and cultivate local contacts, so long as the money kept flowing upward, and the peace with other families and crews was maintained. The Gambino leadership's decision to expand into Florida fit a broader pattern seen across American organized crime in the mid-20th century. As populations shifted and new economic frontiers opened, the families followed. In the 1940s and 1950s, that impulse had taken them west, into the casinos and hotels of Las Vegas, a frontier carved out through partnerships between Italian-American syndicates and Jewish mob figures like Mayor Lansky. Florida, especially its coastal cities, represented a different kind of frontier. Not a single neon-lit strip, but a vast sprawl of neighborhoods and retirement communities where familiar habits, playing the horses, betting on football, borrowing from someone you knew, could be transplanted wholesale. The state was not blank territory. Long before Gambino soldiers began turning up in Palm Beach or Broward County, Tampa had been the domain of Santo Trafficante Jr., a powerful boss whose influence reached into Cuba and beyond. Miami had seen its share of bookmakers and racket bosses, some local, some imported. But the influx of northern retirees in the 1970s created opportunities that existing organizations could not fully monopolize. Families like the Gambinos sent emissaries, sometimes semi-retired figures seeking sun and a softer life, sometimes ambitious soldiers like Agro, willing to put in the work of building a book and a loan portfolio from a new base. It is in this context that his role becomes easier to define. He was neither a policy-setting strategist nor an isolated rogue. He was a mid-level operative tasked with turning demographic change into revenue. His success depended on his ability to bridge worlds. To his New York superiors, he had to demonstrate that the Florida experiment was worth the risk, that he could extract steady profit without triggering open war with local interests or catastrophic legal exposure. To his Florida customers and borrowers, he had to present himself as both approachable and dangerous. A man you could joke with over a plate of pasta, but who also carried, just behind him, the shadow of a crime family whose reputation stretched back to the streets of Brooklyn and the headlines of national newspapers. The Italian-American community from which he emerged was itself changing during these decades. By the 1970s and 1980s, many Italian-American families had moved firmly into the mainstream of American life. Their children and grandchildren were college graduates, professionals, homeowners in suburbs far removed from the cramped tenements of their grandparents. For the vast majority, mob involvement was a distant, often unwelcome association, a stereotype to be rejected rather than a path to be emulated. Yet the persistence of figures like Agro meant that the stigma did not entirely fade. Civil rights organizations and Italian-American advocacy groups protested when media coverage of high-profile cases blurred the line between an ethnic group and the criminal minority within it. They argued, with justification, that the attention given to men like him obscured the reality that most Italian Americans were law-abiding. Inside the law enforcement community, attitudes shifted as well. The crude ethnic profiling that had sometimes colored early anti-mafia efforts gave way slowly to more nuanced approaches. Investigators began to think less in terms of ethnicity and more in terms of specific criminal enterprises, a distinction that mattered in places like Florida, where the same communities that included mob figures also included their potential victims. In training videos and briefings, Agro's case was discussed not as an indictment of a culture, but as a study in how particular networks exploited particular vulnerabilities. Popular culture, meanwhile, walked its own line, one that often frustrated both officials and community leaders. Films and television shows in the late 20th century depicted mobsters with a mixture of glamour and grit. Stylish suits and sharp dialogue coexisted with scenes of brutality and betrayal. Viewers were invited to be repelled and fascinated in equal measure. Against that backdrop, the real life of a man like Agro, long days of phone calls, quiet meetings in unremarkable strip mall restaurants, paperwork hidden in plain sight as betting slips or cash envelopes, could seem almost mundane. There were no cinematic restaurant showdowns in the record, no operatic monologues. Yet buried in that mundanity was a stubborn truth. Most organized crime operates not in bursts of sensational violence, but in the steady application of leverage. It thrives on the ordinary desires of ordinary people, to feel a little thrill on game day, to keep a business afloat through a rough patch, to avoid embarrassment or shame. Agro's Florida operation exemplified that dynamic. The people who sat across from him did not, for the most part, think of themselves as participants in a grand criminal scheme. They were, in their minds, placing a bet like they always had, or taking a loan from a man who seemed to understand their predicament better than any bank manager. That ordinariness also means that the harm he helped inflict can easily be overlooked. It does not leave the kind of visible scars that a headline-grabbing act of violence does. It creeps instead into marriages strained by secret debts, into businesses shuttered after years of quiet extractions, into the mental health of people who live for months or years under the weight of implied threats. When those people tell their stories, often anonymously years later, their tone is different from that of Hollywood victims. It is more resigned, more focused on slow unraveling than sudden shocks. As the decades pass, the distance between Agro's active years and the present grows, and with it, the risk that his name will blur into an indistinct catalog of mobsters of the past. Yet the archival traces of his life continue to be pulled into new conversations. Law school classes on RICO and extortion statutes still study the judicial opinions that grew out of his case, parsing language about reasonable fear and extortionate means that judges used in upholding his conviction. Criminology courses examine the Florida investigation as an example of how to flip an insider and use recordings to map a clandestine business. Occasionally, a student writing a thesis or a journalist researching a story about the Gambino family stumbles across the references and traces them backward, from appellate footnotes to trial transcripts to FBI case files. Each time that happens, Agro's outline sharpens just slightly. Not because new troves of personal material have been discovered, the odds of that after this many years are slim, but because the context around him becomes better understood. As more is learned about how the Gambinos and other families allocated resources to places like Florida, his assignment there takes on clearer meaning. As oral histories accumulate from retired agents and prosecutors, his interactions with law enforcement, once flattened into formal language, regain a hint of the immediacy they had at the time. The surprise in an agent's voice when a tape captured a particularly candid remark, the tension in a prosecutor's office on the morning a key witness took the stand. Even in popular nonfiction, his name continues to surface. Comprehensive histories of the American Mafia, like those by veteran reporters who spent careers covering organized crime, now almost routinely mention the Florida arm of the Gambino family. Agro may appear there only in a paragraph or two, but those paragraphs fix him in a web that includes far better-known figures: Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, John Gotti. The contrast is instructive. Where those bosses occupied the public imagination, walking into court in tailored overcoats, their photographs splashed across front pages, Agro remained, for most of his life, a man known only to his neighbors, his customers, and the circles of law enforcement that tracked him. Yet without men like him, the boss's power would have had little substance. The money that fueled their influence, the reputation that made their names matter in far-flung communities, depended on soldiers doing the work he did. In that sense, the story of Thomas Agro is also a story about the middlemen of history, the figures who rarely occupy center stage but whose actions knit together the structures we later study in textbooks and documentaries. He did not shape national policy or orchestrate seismic shifts in the underworld. He took the tools and opportunities that his world offered, a network of contacts, a willingness to enforce informal contracts, a name that carried its own kind of weight, and applied them in the particular circumstances of Florida in the 1970s and early 1980s. The consequences, for him and for those around him, were profound enough to leave a mark in the archives. What remains, then, as his life recedes further into the past, is less a question about who he was in some intimate, psychological sense than about what his trajectory reveals. It reveals the persistence of certain forms of exploitation in modern societies, even as laws and technologies change around them. It reveals the ways demographic shifts, people moving from one region to another, carrying habits and vulnerabilities with them, create openings for old criminal models in new locales. And it reveals the capacity of legal systems, given time and information, to adapt, to see not only the spectacular crimes that grab headlines, but the quieter forms of coercion that, over time, can do as much damage. These are lessons that extend beyond the particular man whose name appears on the Florida indictments, but they are lessons that cannot be fully understood without tracing, in some detail, how someone like him moved through his world. That tracing, through court records, surveillance logs, memoirs, and memories, is what allows his story to function not only as a cautionary tale from a specific era, but as a case study in the enduring interplay between organized crime, ordinary life, and the institutions that seek to protect one from the corrosions of the other. If you stand today on the streets where Thomas Agro once moved with such easy assurance, there is little to tell you what unfolded there. In Palm Beach County, the low buildings that housed his favorite restaurants have new names. The pay phones he and his associates once relied upon have vanished, replaced by glass doors and Wi-Fi signs. The racetracks where he walked the grandstands, eyes tracking both horses and potential bettors, have been renovated, rebranded, or closed altogether. Traffic moves past the old addresses without pausing. The fear that once clung to certain booths and back rooms has dissipated into the humid Florida air. In New York, too, The neighborhoods that shaped him have changed. The tenements that sheltered the children of Italian immigrants have given way, in many places, to renovated apartments and boutiques. Social clubs that once drew a steady flow of men in dark suits have been converted into cafes or simply shuttered. The names that once carried such weight on those streets, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, still surface occasionally in the news, but the mystique that once surrounded them is thinner, repeatedly punctured by trials, biographies, and the testimony of defectors. The city that taught Agro how to navigate a life in the shadows has itself become less hospitable to the old ways. Yet the forces that sent him south and sustained his Florida career have not disappeared. They have only changed form. People still crave the excitement of gambling, even as it has migrated onto screens and into regulated casinos. Small business owners still face moments of cash flow crisis. Individuals still reach for quick credit when emergencies strike. The difference in many cases is that the pathways available to them now run more often through licensed institutions than through men whose power rests on whispered reputations and implied threats. Where those legitimate pathways are narrow or blocked, the old patterns can reemerge. That is where Agro's story retains its sharpest relevance. Seen from the vantage point of the early 21st century, his life can seem almost old-fashioned, a relic of an analog underworld. His tools were telephones, handwritten ledgers, in-person visits. The leverage he relied on flowed not from sophisticated financial instruments or digital surveillance, but from word-of-mouth knowledge. Who had paid on time for 20 years, who was one bad week away from ruin, who had the kind of temperament that responded to a quiet reminder rather than to a display of temper. In that sense, his world was intensely personal. Every debt, every bet, had a story behind it. Every decision to extend more credit or to tighten the screws was a judgment call, made by a man who prided himself on reading those stories correctly. That personal quality complicates attempts to paint him in simple colors. The easy narratives in crime history tend to fall into two camps: the demon, stripped of all nuance, and the anti-hero, romanticized beyond recognition. The surviving evidence about Agro pushes against both. He participated in and profited from a system that relied on intimidation, and that deepened the misfortune of people already in trouble. That much is clear from court records, from the voices of his victims, from his own recorded words. At the same time, those who knew him in non-criminal settings, neighbors, casual acquaintances, even some of his former customers, remember a man who could be courteous, who asked about families, who tipped well in restaurants, who knew how to put people at ease before imposing his terms. For the documentary lens, this duality is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. Criminal history is full of such figures, men and women who were polite to their children's teachers and ruthless with their debtors, who attended baptisms and weddings between days spent orchestrating schemes that harmed strangers. Agro was one of them. Any account that pretends otherwise, casting him solely as a monster or, conversely, as a charismatic rogue, misses the point. The danger he represented lay precisely in his ability to move easily between those modes, to make his world feel, to those inside it, like just another way of doing business. The institutions that confronted him, for their part, were not static, faceless forces. The agents who trailed his car through Florida streets, the prosecutors who listened to hours of wiretap recordings, the judges who weighed evidence at trial, each brought their own histories, biases, and evolving understandings to the work. Some had grown up in communities where organized crime was a shadow in the background. Others came from places where the very idea of a mob seemed like something from fiction, until they saw the transcripts and financial records on their desks. Over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, many of them learned, as they pursued cases like Agro's, to look beyond the sensational headlines toward the subtler patterns. For some, the case left a lasting imprint. Retired agents have recalled, in oral history projects and memoirs, The moment they first heard his voice on tape, the careful way he weighed how far to push a reluctant borrower, the almost bored tone he took when discussing someone's failure to pay. They speak of a satisfaction in seeing him convicted, but also of the lingering knowledge that, for every operation dismantled, others adapted. The Agro investigation did not end organized crime in Florida. It forced it to change shape. That recognition shaped how the next generation of investigators approached their work, with less illusion of final victory and more focus on steady containment. On the other side of the ledger, the families of those convicted in the wave of anti-mafia prosecutions, including Agros, absorbed the human cost of those legal successes. Wives who had grown accustomed to their husbands' absences and opaque explanations now had to navigate life as the spouse of an imprisoned man, dealing with lawyers, prison visits, and financial instability. Children, some of them only dimly aware of what their fathers really did for a living, confronted the stigma of a surname that had appeared in connection with organized crime. Some chose to distance themselves, changing names, moving away. Others, for a time, tried to hold on to a sense of pride in their family history, only later coming to terms with the harm woven into it. Little is publicly known about how Agro's immediate family coped with his arrest, illness, and death. They did not seek the spotlight, and there is no record of them granting interviews or publishing accounts. Their silence is its own kind of testimony, a refusal to participate in the mythology that sometimes grows up around organized crime figures, a decision to let the man be remembered, if at all, through impersonal archives rather than through carefully curated recollections. For them, the story that fascinates historians and true crime audiences was lived not as narrative but as a series of disruptions, sudden moves, unwanted questions, worry about the future. This gap between public fascination and private cost is one of the tensions that hangs over any attempt to revisit Agro's life. The appetite for tales of the mafia remains strong. Television schedules and bestseller lists attest to that. But the ethics of telling such stories have sharpened. Documentaries now routinely include voices that earlier treatments might have skipped. Victims, community activists, legal scholars, sometimes even offenders who have renounced the life. The goal is not to drain the stories of interest, but to anchor that interest in a clear understanding of consequences. In Agro's case, those consequences can be traced along several lines. There is the obvious financial harm to borrowers and bettors who lost far more than they ever gained. There is the climate of fear his operation helped create, in which seeking help, from police, from regulators, from community organizations, felt, to many, more dangerous than enduring the pressure. There is the way his presence, and that of other mob figures, warped local economies, steering money into unproductive channels, discouraging legitimate investment in neighborhoods seen as mobbed up. And there is the toll on the men directly under him, associates like Yanuzzi, whose own lives were deformed by long exposure to a system that normalized coercion. Reflecting on those threads, you begin to see why his life, though seemingly small compared to the grand dramas that played out in New York's federal courthouses, matters in the larger history of American crime. It bridges scales. At one end, it connects to the national story of how the mid-century mafia rose and fell, the consolidation under bosses like Carlo Gambino, the expansion into new territories, the eventual unraveling under sustained legal pressure. At the other, it connects to the granular realities of how that abstract mafia touched individual lives in strip malls, diners, and cramped living rooms. Without stories at that middle scale, the term becomes an empty label. Agro's trajectory also illuminates the importance and the fragility of personal choice within structural constraints. He was shaped by his time and place, by Depression-era hardship, by the presence of powerful criminal networks in his neighborhood, by the limited economic options available to young men from his background. Those factors made a life in organized crime easier to imagine and to enter, but they did not make it inevitable. Many of his peers, raised in similar circumstances, found other paths. Some became union workers or small business owners who, ironically, would later find themselves on the other side of his desk, negotiating loans or struggling to pay off gambling debts. This is not to deny the power of environment, but to resist a kind of fatalism that turns every mobster's biography into destiny. When he chose to extend credit at ruinous terms to struggling borrowers, when he chose to drop the Gambino name into conversations to instill fear, when he chose to respond to suspected theft with a beating severe enough to nearly kill a man, he was making decisions within a continuum of possible responses. That those decisions fit neatly within the norms of his criminal culture does not absolve them. It underscores how cultures of exploitation are maintained, not by abstract forces alone, but by repeated, individual acts. The legal system's response to those acts, in turn, was also a series of choices. Legislators chose to craft statutes like RICO and the federal laws governing extortionate credit. Prosecutors chose to apply them to figures like Agro, rather than focusing solely on more conventionally defined violent crime. Agents chose to invest years in cultivating a fragile witness like Iannuzzi, knowing that the case could collapse if he faltered. Judges chose to uphold convictions in the face of defense arguments about entrapment and the ambiguities of coded language. Each of those choices helped to redraw the boundaries of acceptable business practice in places where, for too long, those boundaries had been blurred. What his story ultimately offers, then, is a layered portrait of an era when those boundaries were contested. The mid to late 20th century in the United States saw a series of institutional reckonings, with segregation, with political corruption, with corporate malfeasance, and in the arena that encompassed Agro's life, with organized crime. In each case, long-standing practices that many had come to view as inevitable, if not exactly legitimate, were challenged. In each case, those who had profited from the old arrangements insisted that the challenge was overreach, that things had always been done this way. And in each case, progress was uneven, partial, sometimes marred by its own excesses, but real. As the camera of a contemporary documentary pulls back from reenactments and archival footage, from grainy photographs of a younger Agro outside a racetrack or a courtroom, it can settle on quieter images. The exterior of a former social club now housing a daycare, a stretch of Florida highway where, to anyone passing by, nothing remarkable has ever happened, the worn cover of a legal casebook in which his name appears in a footnote. These are the traces that remain when the noise of a criminal career has faded. The narrative that began with a man walking toward a courthouse, flanked by marshals and reporters' microphones, ends not with a dramatic last stand, but with the slow fading of his presence from the places he once dominated. That fading is not erasure. The record endures, in transcripts and memories, in the altered practices of law enforcement, in the cautious eyes of older residents who still remember when certain restaurants were best avoided after dark. But the world into which Thomas Agro was born, and the underworld in which he made his name, have both receded. What remains for us is the responsibility to read that record carefully, to resist both sensationalism and simplification. His life is not a blueprint to be followed, nor a lurid tale to be consumed and forgotten. It is a window into how crime can take root in the ordinary, how institutions can adapt to confront it, and how, in the end, even powerful men in small domains are subject to the same final limits as everyone else. In tracing his journey from the crowded streets of mid-century New York to a federal medical ward and an unheralded death, we are reminded that history's most important lessons often reside in stories that, on their surface, seem local and narrow, and that the line between the visible and the hidden in any era is thinner than it first appears.